Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader here at Intertek for our medical and laboratory business. And today I am so thrilled to be joined by Ollie Moyrong. Hi, Ollie. How are you doing today?
Hi, doing fine, Clarissa.
Awesome. So Ollie works out of our Menlo Park, California office and is our EMC Manager. Ollie, maybe you can share a little bit about what it means when we say EMC and what your background is, working in the EMC field.
Yeah, so EMC is an acronym for electromagnetic compliance. That's actually has to deal with radio frequency waves and the amount of RF energy a device is emitting that it might interfere with something else, or it can be the opposite way around, which is immunity, so it can accept RF interference to make sure it can operate as intended. So I've been at Intertek for about 25 years, just strictly in the field of EMC testing. I specialize in testing like medical devices, industrial devices, radio transmitters. I'm a TCB reviewer for the FCC, which means I can certify radio devices.
Yeah. So, being at Intertek for 25 years, being in the EMC field, obviously you've seen it all, right? I mean, as you mentioned, you've tested everything from medical devices to big pieces of industrial equipment. And obviously today we're going to chat about, EMC and how that relates to medical devices specifically. So, in your course of your time here at Intertek, what are some of the changes and things that you've seen in the medical device industry with the types of products that we're seeing to test, the types of functionality that we're seeing, those advancements in technology that have really taken place, not only over the last, 25 years, but also, really within the last 5+ years that we're seeing?
Yeah, so one thing I've seen a trend that's being really popular these days, not only with medical devices, but just like consumer devices in general, is everybody wants to make everything smart, right?
Yeah.
So they want the convenience of being able to let go of wires. They want whatever functionality where they're tethered by a wire to be wireless. They want functionality where I have a smart device, like a smartphone. I want to be able to see what's going on with my device, or I want to be able to get updates from whatever processes or data collection my device is doing. I want to be able to have that, that capability to see on my smart device. So that's really popular right now. A lot of people are incorporating some type of wireless functionality into their equipment. That could be in different forms.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting too, right? When you talk about medical devices and consumer devices and things becoming smart, because I think now we see such a crossover in that space, right? Where they're all kind of converging, because things that we think of as like traditional medical devices, now we're seeing this move towards medical devices that may seem more like consumer devices or have this smart element or are being used in home health settings, right? Outside of a controlled doctor's office or clinic or hospital. So now, right, the requirements for EMC, because you're taking it out of this, very stringent controlled environment, obviously have changed quite a bit, because now you could be, walking through the grocery store with your medical device on, or walking into your own home or in and out of office buildings. So what do you see as it, in kind of that space as we're seeing this convergence of medical home health devices that are with you kind of on the go and on the move, and how that impacts EMC?
Yeah. So what that brings with it, it's a different set of compliance requirements, right? So like a typical consumer device that's not medical, right? Let's say, for example, you might have like an iPad or like a smartphone. It needs to meet requirements technically. Basically, it'd be like the FCC requirements, right? And what those requirements are basically emissions to make sure that you don't interfere with other equipment. Now, because you incorporated that into a medical device, then you have to take into account the collateral standard for EMC, which is 60601-1-2, that has emissions and immunity requirements. So you have to do all those immunity tests. And then on top of that, most likely the FDA is going to ask you to do some type of wireless coexistence testing. Right. And then and the FDA has a guidance document for that. It's AAMI TIR 69. And in that document, they say you follow the standard to do the test method, which is ANSI C63.27. There's another standard that they use if there's concern that you might have some susceptibility to like RFID devices. Inside the hospital, a lot of equipment use RFID technology. So if there's coexistence requirements or concerns about that, then there's a specific standard, which is AAMI 7351731. That's another standard that they might do. And also built into the collateral standard for EMC, which is 601-1-2. There's specific sections in there that try to address coexistence.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit because obviously it can get overwhelming when we think, okay, I'm going to take my medical device, I'm going to make it a smart device, or I'm developing a device that might be used in an uncontrolled setting or has a wireless capability. So let's start with the 60601-1-2, right? As you mentioned, the collateral standard for medical for EMC. So how does it address wireless requirements just within the base standard itself?
Okay, so there's a requirement for radiated RF field immunity. Right, so that's the form of interference that most likely this coexistence is going to come in. So they already have a specific frequency range that they want you to test against. Mm-hmm. And then there's a specific table. It's table 9. And what it is in there is it focuses on specific frequencies that are commonly used by these licensed transmitters out there. So there's frequencies like that are used by Wi-Fi devices, Bluetooth devices, mm-hmm. that are used like by cellular phones, like there's specific LTE bands. And so they want you to replicate those signals, and they want you to apply it at a very high level. Something that would be similar to your equipment being exposed to this, like if you use your cell phone right adjacent next to your equipment. So these are extremely high test levels, and hopefully that covers some of the coexistence requirements.
Got it. Understood. And so when we're looking at the standard specifically, right, with the 1-2, obviously we know there's the new version of the standard, the 4th edition, Amendment 1. So are these requirements in both versions, the 4th edition of the standard and the Amendment 1? Is this just being pulled from the Amendment 1 standard?
Yeah. So the 4.0 edition, which published in 2014, that one has the table 9, mm-hmm. where you would expose it to these common frequencies that are used by these popular radio devices like LTE or Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. What it didn't have is the lower frequency end. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by the lower frequency is like technologies such that are used by like RFID. So the Amendment 1 actually added what's called table 11, I believe is the table. And mm-hmm. in there, there's specific frequency range just to address RFID immunity, right? And those are in line with the AIM 7351731, which was a specific standard just to address RFID immunity. So there's a good chance if you do the testing to the 4.1 table 11, it'll cover some of the requirements of that other standard.
Understood. I think we see, right, just, if the first version was released 4th edition in 2014, right, we know how much things have changed, right, in terms of connectivity and what that means and the different types and different ways that you can connect a device. So obviously now with the newer version of the standard, it's going to, of course, be more inclusive because we've had so many advances over the last few years, right? And now we'll see it, as we move into more things, including 5G, obviously we'll anticipate that test requirements might even change again, right? As we continue to advance in terms of what it means to be connected and what it means to be smart with products.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that, right? So I think, even just from the devices that we see over the last few years, right? We've seen a lot of people talk about incorporating these smart elements, either with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or LTE or, all of these different things. So walk us through that process, like how you look at it. Okay, I'm a manufacturer. I'm going to go purchase a module off the shelf to help make my device smarter, to help me have this level of connectivity. Like how do you kind of navigate that process if this is something you've been considering and now want to pull the trigger on or ready to move forward on?
Yeah, so you have different options available to you. The easiest way to incorporate some type of wireless connectivity to your equipment is to use a pre-approved radio module. So what that means, like say for the USA market, you want to get a radio module that already has an FCC ID. And if it does, then you don't have to go through all the motions of, getting it fully tested and certified. But you do want to keep in mind that when you do incorporate this pre-approved radio module, that you're integrating it into your equipment and you're following the manufacturer's instructions. So they should have specific instructions within their user's manual. I'll tell you, okay, you're not allowed to modify it. You need to install it according to these recommendations. You have to use their exact same antenna, right? You don't have to modify the grant. And then what you should do, there's actually a document published by the FTC, by the FCC that gives you guidance on what your responsibilities are to ensure compliance after this radio module has been installed inside your equipment. So the FCC document is KDB 996369. So that's the document you want to follow. It's readily available on the internet. And then it'll tell you in there that it's very highly recommended that after you've installed this pre-approved radio module inside your host equipment, that at a minimum, you need to do a spot check for radiated emissions, right? Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, it is your responsibility to make sure that this radio is still in compliance with the requirements of the FCC.
Right. I think sometimes too, we see even manufacturers testing above and beyond that, obviously, because they want to do their own due diligence and show that, okay, not only have we incorporated this approved module, but we also do all of this testing to satisfy, regulatory requirements for other agencies that they might be going to as well.
Yeah. And then if Europe is one of your target markets as well, the European Union has a similar guidance document. It's called TGN01. Is the name of the document, but it's essentially the same as what the FCC requirements are. But in Europe, they have additional requirements other than emissions. They actually have immunity requirements, right? So there's a recommendation in there that after you've installed this radio module inside your device, you're going to run through like a limited emissions testing, which probably most likely is going to include radiated emissions. But also they want you to run through the full suite of immunity tests.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, observing the functionality of the radio while it's installed inside your host. Because when they did the testing on the radio module, it's probably just sitting on a table and doing its functions. But now, because it's inside your host, then there could be interference from the host. There could be interference from maybe other, depending on how you integrated this into your host, there's other interference that radio module can be it could be exposed to that was different. So you can't just automatically carry the test results from the radio module by itself and assume it's still going to be in compliance after you put inside your host.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the things we hear oftentimes or talk a lot about is this idea of these approved modules and what that actually means. So to your point, right, you reference, okay, you may get a module that's approved for the US with an FCC ID. When you're purchasing a module, it will have 1, 2, 5, 10 countries that it might be approved for, right? So you can't go in thinking, I'm buying this module off the shelf. It's going to be approved globally for every single country requirements.
Yeah. So you have to be aware that radio, if it's an intentional radiator, which is AKA, it's some type of radio module that may most likely the different markets or the different countries, they're all going to have their independent certification requirements for radios that are different from a non-radio device, right? So like countries like Japan, South Korea, like Taiwan, they're going to expect you to do their testing to their particular standard, and then you're going to have an equivalent of an FCC ID, but it's an ID just for that particular country. So you want to make sure that the module that you're using is certified for those countries.
Yeah, so right, you may get a module that's approved for US, Canada, Europe, and then you may have additional testing requirements for other countries that you're trying to satisfy, registrations, things like that.
Yeah, so it's just because a radio module isn't certified for a particular country that you want to market to, that just means you have to do the test.
Mm-hmm. And, when we see this, is there an ongoing compliance factor to this as well? Or once you test with the module, the FCC ID, it lasts for a certain amount of time, it lasts forever, or for different countries? What do we see in terms of the length of time that you can have certified?
Yeah, it's going to be different by country, but fortunately for the FCC, the FCC ID, that certification, it does not expire. It's valid for that device and that design as long as it hasn't been modified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point as well, right, that you kind of mentioned earlier, right? So it assumes that you're not modifying or changing the antennas or doing anything within the module itself. What if you do need to modify the antenna or want to make a modification? How does that impact the testing for a module? Yeah,
so it's on a case-by-case basis. Or normally what you want to do is you want to discuss that with one of the compliance lab that you're working with. Mm-hmm. Let's say, for example, if you want to change the antenna, then you'd have to do some testing to make sure that with this new antenna, it still meets the FCC requirements. And then you're going to have to do some sort of filing. So the FCC does allow the change of antennas. That's normally when you do the filing with the FCC to include this new antenna, it's going to be done under what's called a Class 2 permissive change, right? Okay. And that could be done either under the OEM who makes that radio module, if they've agreed to update the filing on your behalf, or you can do the filing, but you need their permission to say that you can update the filing. So what normally happens is you do a transfer under your name, under their permission, and then once it's under your name, you can do the Class 2 permissive change with the new antenna.
Interesting. And what if we get into a space where like I can't find a module that's approved that works for me, or I find a module that's unapproved and I need to do the testing myself, right?
Yeah. That actually happens quite often, just because maybe the radio module, the form factor doesn't fit your application. So a lot of companies out there, they sell these reference design, they sell these chipsets. They're like fully approved. They're not fully approved, but it's a chip that has everything. The only thing you have to do is you have to design it onto your PC board, right? But it doesn't have any testing. So in that case, we have to run through all of the testing, right? And then you're going to have keep in mind that along with the testing, you actually have to do the filing as well. And with that filing, there's a bunch of, they call them exhibits. And these are pretty much design documents that detail all of the design characteristics of this radio device. That can include block diagrams, schematics, theory of operation. If you're using a radio chipset, then normally it'd be your PCB design, but a lot of the theory of operation and block diagram about that radio circuit, you would get that from the manufacturer who made the radio chip.
And then now essentially you've certified this module and you can
you'd have to
test as part of your system.
So what would happen then is you would get your own FCC ID, right? The FCC ID is made up of what they call a grinding code. So the grinding code is it's a unique ID just for your company that's issued by the FCC. It's normally a 3 to 5 character code, and then you apply for that for the FCC. So all FCC IDs, they start with your grinding code, whatever was assigned by the FCC, and then you put a product code after it, and that could be anything that you want. Normally people put something like the model number.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's interesting and worth noting too, right, different than some other certification schemes, right, with some things like an FCC ID, that's public information, right? So that's something that's easily able to be accessed and looked up, right? Like FCC information.
Yeah, so anything that has an FCC ID, it's going to be on the FCC website. It is all public information. Like your grant will be there, the test reports will be there. There are some design documents that the FCC does allow you to make confidential. So normally people will make schematics, block diagram, theory of operation. They'll allow you to keep those exhibits confidential.
Yeah. So one thing that we're seeing too, I think is a trend overall just in the medical device space with the different types of products that we're seeing is these more complicated, complex systems, right? That might include multiple pieces, multiple devices, even maybe multiple types of transmission, right? Maybe you have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, LTE, a combination of things together. How do we treat that from a test case scenario, right? If I have a main system that then connects to a smart device and then also connects to an accessory or a wireless charging station, right? How do we treat that when we're looking at it from a test perspective when you have multiple types of connectivity, right?
Yeah, so normally what we like to do is we like to break it down. So, I mean, you're going to have to do, so it depends on maybe all the devices aren't maybe all the radios aren't going to be communicating at the same time, right? So if that's the case, then there's going to be a specific test plan for that. If they're testing at the same time, which is called simultaneous transmission, then there's a test case for that. So there's requirements for the medical standard, right? So we're going to do the testing to 60601-1-2, and we're going to be monitoring the functionality of those radios. Most likely you're going to want to do wireless coexistence on those radios. And for the different types of radio protocols, there's actually specific tests that you have to do. just for that protocol. So there's a specific test method if you're using Wi-Fi, specific one if you're using Bluetooth or if you're using LTE. So we have to apply those. And then there's a FCC recommended testing for after you've integrated that inside your host. So we're going to apply the specific FCC rule parts for those specific RF protocols.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's going to be something that we'll see more and more of, right, as we continue to see these systems get more complex. And as you say, right, as everyone wants things that are smart, doctors want the data transmitted, or you want it to be able to charge wirelessly, or, move around a hospital or move around a home, right? I think we'll just see more and more of that. Before we wrap up, I do want to talk a little bit about the wireless coexistence. I know we touched on that briefly earlier, and Nick and I talked about that in an earlier podcast as well, right? Looking at this, new standard for wireless coexistence specifically that's outside of the tables that are referenced in the 60601-1-2 4th edition. So when we talk about wireless coexistence from an actual testing perspective, right? What does that mean when you're testing to the wireless coexistence standard, and how does that differ from what's listed in the tables?
Yeah, so what they're trying to do when we do testing for wireless coexistence is we want to make sure that your equipment can operate as intended when it's exposed to these other different types of outside interference. But also we want to make sure that your equipment doesn't interfere with other equipment that's causing the interference, right? So we do the testing to ANSI 63.27, and that's actually done inside our 10-meter chamber. Mm-hmm. And then we do a baseline communication for your equipment to make sure, and then we set it the distance between your equipment and whatever companion device that you're communicating with. We try to set that up at a threshold where it like barely operates, but it's still operating. Okay. And then we introduce our interference signal, right? And then our interference signal is we use a communication test set so we can monitor what's coming out of it. And the standard has like very specific RF protocol that you need to be transmitting, and then we're observing that communication throughput on the other side, and then we make sure that your equipment can function at a certain distance. So our equipment that's applying the disturbance is actually set in direct line of sight of the equipment that we're testing, right? So that means is your equipment is right smack dab in the middle, and then we have our transmitting and receiving equipment on opposite sides of you, and we vary those distances to see like what the threshold if there's going to be any failure, right? So we'll vary that distance anywhere between 10 meters, because that's the largest space we could go inside our chamber, all the way up to like touching your equipment, like maybe 1 centimeter, right?
As close as you can possibly get, yeah.
Yeah, and the purpose for coexistence is there's really no pass or fail. What we're trying to do is we're trying to determine the threshold, like what distance can your equipment still operate at, like when the disturbing equipment is there, and then if you cause interference to the disturbing equipment, like what's going to be that threshold distance that needs to be maintained so you don't interfere with the other equipment. So it goes both ways, and then so it's kind of a trial and error. It takes time to do this test because you're always varying the distances to try to find the threshold, and then we just report that.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. And as I mentioned, Nick, our EMC chief, and I chatted about this on one of our earlier podcasts as well, with what we're seeing with the FDA putting out their guidance document and the importance that they're placing on coexistence. Because as we know, and right, from testing so many devices, before we would get a lot of feedback like, hey, now we need to see you test a coexistence, or now we want to see additional coexistence data, right, when people would submit to the FDA. And now I think they've made it even clearer, right, how important coexistence is, and that they have this expectation that they're going to receive that data with your submission.
Yes.
And one thing too, within the coexistence standard, I remember we've chatted about this before, right, with the different levels within the standard, right, different tiers, 1, 2, 3. What does that mean for a device manufacturer?
Yeah, so you have to go back to the guidance document, which is the TIR 69. They have as categories 1, 2, and 3, but those coincide to the test method and CC 63.27, which calls them tiers 1, 2, and 3. So depending on the, I guess, the importance of this data communication, if it has a critical importance that that the radio function needs to be maintained. That's the highest tier, which is tier 1, right? So let's say, for example, if the wireless communication was used and the result of that communication not happening was going to be life-threatening, then of course that's going to be a tier 1, and that has the most severe test cases. And then for that, you would have to subject your equipment to multiple kinds of interference. And then they have the tier 2, which is like a little bit in the middle, and then they have the easiest one that has the less testing requirements, which is tier 3.
Got it. Understood. So, Ollie, this was such a good conversation. I love talking about EMC. I think we could just talk about EMC and wireless forever. I don't think this is, of course, anything that's going to be going away. I think we'll just see more and more advancements in technology and, more and more complexity in the devices that we're seeing, as well as the test methods that we're using. Any final thoughts to share? Any thoughts on the future with 5G or things being incorporated, or different types of upcoming testing methods or things that you're hearing about?
Yeah, so I mean, there's always brand new radio technologies that are going to be emerging, and as those technologies become more established, then there's going to be new test methods that are always going to be coming out, right? So for now, there's an ANSI C63.27, which addresses like protocols like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, LTE. Those are like really popular right now. Who knows? Coming down the road, there's 5G millimeter wave. There might be something that needs to be addressed for that. So it's good to keep in tune with this, and to do that, there's a lot of requirements that the FCC publishes and the European Union publishes. If you can keep track of it, or I would advise you just to partner up with the lab, because they're the ones who are it's their business to keep up to date with all of these changes.
Yeah, it's definitely the definition of a moving target, right? Like what's true today might not be true tomorrow, might not be true 6 months from now, right? Because we're just seeing these constant new developments. So really appreciate your time today. As I said, this was such a good conversation.
My pleasure.
If people want to get a hold of us, they can email me directly, and I will make sure to get those questions over to Ollie and get you guys connected. And if there's anything else you'd like us to cover on the podcast, please reach out and let me know. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we really appreciate your time. Thanks.